Welcome back to my YouTube channel. In this video we're going to make a San Francisco style Bowie knife. It is one of my favorite style of knives to make, so enjoy the process. Here I am starting to cut some strips of AEB-L stainless. This is going to be a stack of stainless steel and pure nickel sheets. You can see here I'm just cleaning up the edges and the sides and the corners, making sure all the burrs are removed. Now I have some pure nickel sheet here, and I'm just scribing a line. This sheet of nickel is so thin that I can just cut it with a pair of kitchen shears. There's one strip. Time to tap it straight. So there we have the 3 strips. These I will cut in 2-inch little length pieces. So the sizes of these are 2-inch by 1-inch by about 9/1000ths of an inch thick. The AEB-L in this stack is about 110/1000ths of an inch. You can see interchanging the nickel and the stainless. And I like to press the stack because of the thin nickel. It tends to have a little bit of springiness, so I just press it in the hydraulic press. And then I give it a clamp. And it's important with any kind of stainless steel is to have a very clean atmosphere. So here I am TIG welding all the seams. I really want to make sure that this billet is completely sealed off so that no oxygen can get into this billet when I bring it up to temperature. Those are pretty colors. Let's weld a handle on there. That way I can move it in and out of the forge easily. There we go, ready to forge. Let's turn on the gas forge. This will get the temperature nice and hot. I'm going to be using my 40 kilo Roomba power hammer. It really works very hard for me, and it's always working when I need it to. Look at that, the first forge weld pass, very successful. Forge welds very easily. There's the bar drawn out. I'm going to let that cool very slowly because I want to cut it up into little slices and then restack it. Again, we want to make sure that everything is good and clean for that restack, because if there's any scale or any impurities, then the stack will not like to weld together easily. So here I am just marking out 5 places. I will cut this strip into 5 sections, and then once I restack those layers, I will end up with a total of 175 layers of metal. In this stack, there is roughly 8% nickel. This gives the edge a very good toothiness through use, but with the AEB-L, the hardenable stainless layer, it still gives it a lot of good hardness. So here I am free forge welding and drawing out that billet. You can see that power hammer is such a champion. So easy to draw that metal out. Now I'm going to install a laddering die set on my power hammer. So these I bolt on, and those kind of chomping type jaws will force the layers to be kind of swirly. Spritz a little bit of oil on there, that way the billet won't stick. Bam, 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 look at that. It's like the power hammer is eating the metal. So now it's really just distorting the layers into like a swirly motion. Look at that billet. Beautiful. Alright, so in order to retain those swirly patterns, I need to grind off all these bumps. slip it back into my forge after I do that. And in my left hand I am using a little strip of metal that'll help me forge it down to the same thickness. I'm going to forge a tang onto this piece and pull this bar through the roller mill. The roller mill will leave a very even thickness. It'll come off the roller mill looking like it was from a steel yard. Look at that, beautiful. Just straighten that out on the anvil, make sure that tang is nice. And then we're going to go through a long heat treating cycle. This heat treatment cycle came from Devin Thomas, who is in my opinion, the king of stainless Damascus. So here I am marking out with my template roughly how long the piece of metal needs to be. Slice it off with the bandsaw. And the first thing I'm going to do is surface grind this piece. That will make everything flat and clean. Make sure I grind all the impurities off the surface. Each pass I lower the wheel about 2 to 3 thousandths of an inch. This is a 1945 Norton surface grinder. It was used in the war effort. I'm using some layout fluid now to coat the billet, and I'm clamping my template on there. Then using a sharp scribe, I scribe around the perimeter of the template and then begin profiling on the belt grinder. The belt grinder does this work easily. Just checking for thickness here and making some mathematical calculations. This will tell me roughly where the center of the tang is. I should say not roughly, but very accurately, using this height gauge. So with the bandsaw, I'm just going to trim off some excess material. This is where the screws will be cut on the very end of the tang here. And then again, using the belt grinder, just cleaning up the tang, getting close to the line. So at this point, I'm putting on a file guide. And this I will clamp into my milling machine and cut a little step right behind the blade. So right behind the ricasso of the blade. This way the tang, in this case it's 12 thousandths of an inch thinner than the blade. And then I surface grind the rest of the tang to that same thickness. Then using a square file, I start cleaning up these shoulders. You can see there's a little bit of rock in that stone, so the stone will get it to finished perfect level. And then we just kind of clean everything up on a finer belt. Everything's looking nice. You can see that step really nicely. Time to just sand the blade a little bit prior to heat treatment. Moving on to making the threads in the end of the tang. I'm starting by grinding little 45-degree angles on the end of the tang and rounding that off, mount that in my vise, and then using a 8x32 die, I am cutting little threads into the end of the tang. It's a bit of a pain in the butt material because of the hardness of the stainless and the softness of the nickel. Overall, it will produce a very nice cutting edge, but when cutting these threads in, it was a little bit tricky. Now let's get this heat treatment cycle in, coated with Condorcel, and we got the hardening temperature for AEB-L set, and we're ready to plate quench. So we're pulling this out, slipping it in between these two plates, blowing compressed air on it. This will cool the blade quickly. It'll keep the blade flat. AEB-L does really well with a plate quench. But not just a plate quench, I like to slip it into the freezer for at least an hour and then into the oven for temper. Looking good after heat treatment. All right, let's start working on some fittings here. This is 416 stainless. Cutting off just a little slice. Going to clean it up on the surface grinder. Again, using some layout fluid. Just going to color it, and then I'm going to start marking out where the tang slot is going to be. This little mini mill I bought a few years ago has served me very well. I have a self-centering vise in here with parallels and a little spring between the parallels so that the parallels stay flat against the jaws of the vise. Using a little 8-inch end mill, I start to cut the groove in. And I always set my dial indicator onto the table. This way I can measure how much to the side I need to move. So in this case I had to move the slot over. Let's give it a little test fit. It's not going on very far. There you go. Okay, so now we have some gaps we need to address, so we'll just use some little needle files. Files are slow, but they're very precise. You can really take your time. Let's give it another try. Hammer it on. And yes, that's a nice tight fit. Trim off the excess off this guard. So perfect. Now we're going to move on to some thin stainless spacers. Same idea. We're going to mill those out on the milling machine. Mill the slots a little wider. Perfect. And for a thicker spacer, I will add some of this stainless Damascus. So here I'm cutting off a little piece, and I will surface grind it. Those extra plates there are just to keep it from sliding around. Once I mark it out, then I will mill it too. Here's a time lapse of it. Do the last little bit of to-shape filing. So, got the guard, front spacer, then we got the middle spacer and the back spacer. Let's tap those on, make sure everything fits perfect. Yes, everything fits perfect. All right, now to move on to the handle body. Take some measurements, and this is a big chunk of 416 stainless. I will cut off a slice of this. And then down the length of it, I will cut 2 other slices. That way I'll just split this bar into 3 slices, and I'll be just using one of these slices for this project. So here I am just surface grinding to make sure everything is perfectly flat. Getting some thickness, length, and width measurements. Again, using some layout fluid, start coloring the steel and getting some scratches on there. Because I'm using a very sharp scribe, the lines are very thin and are very easy to see. So this is going to be a through tang construction. So because I'm going into this big piece of metal, I first begin by carving out a little section of the tang. And then I'm cutting out this trough in the side. This will let me push the tang all the way through, and you can see the tang then from the side. Once I finish the handle, you won't see that trough anymore. Drilling the hole in the back, the little center drill first, and then a 240 thousandths drill bit. And then I push in a 310 thousandths end mill. This will leave a nice countersunk spot. All right, now that it's slid together, you can see the tang is nice and centered. I'm going to screw in a temporary little tang nut. See? Yeah, everything fits perfect. All right, let's trim off some of the excess off of this handle. And then I surface grind the side of the guard. Put some layout fluid on the guard again. And we trim the correct height on the spacers. We're going to glue these spacers together using some CA glue. A little clamp. First thing I do now is I'm going to drill some alignment pinholes. Because we will be using some mother of pearl handle scales on this piece, I will be cutting out a big template for my pantograph. My pantograph is currently set up as a 3:1 ratio, so the template needs to be 3 times larger than the handle. For the template, I am using a plastic called Trespa. It is a very hard and wear-resistant plastic, but it machines very nicely too. So I'm first starting with making the male end of the template. And then I move on to the female end. I'm putting some plastic down. And there's the female template. I'm going to clamp that template on there very good. And with a wax, I'm going to coat around the male template. Place that into position. You can see it's a very sloppy fit, but that's all right. I'm using some hard epoxy. And I'm going to fill up the gap in between. Now, because I put some wax on the male template, after the epoxy cures, I'll be able to pull it apart. Making sure glue is everywhere in all the corners and nooks. All right, let's take these clamps off. See what we have. Pull that piece of silicone off. We're just going to sand some of that epoxy off. It's kind of covering all over it. Always make a little extra. And since the mark almost wore out, just going to make sure that we write good on there that what is up. This will really help with the orientation of the handle pieces. Ooh, what a nice fit. That fits great. All right, here is the mother of pearl we will be using on the handle. Some presentation grade pearl. It has some beautiful figure. These pieces have some very beautiful figure. This is a little test template I made just to see where I'd like the most interesting figure. Using some plastic and glue, I'm just going to glue onto the plastic these pieces of mother of pearl. This is the pantograph. On the right side I have the tracer arm, and on the left the cutting. So first thing I want to do is make sure that I mount this mother of pearl in the correct place. Start up the machine and we're going to start doing some cutting. Now the tracer I'm using to trace around the template is 3 times larger than the bit as well. So there's one scale finished. Soak it in some acetone and the plastic comes off, and the scale, you can see it's so beautifully shaped. I have a bunch of different tracers. When I make the trough inside the handle, I want to start with a larger tracer and kind of slowly ease up towards the final size. So starting with a larger tracer, I make sure that I cut out the bulk of the trough and then ease up towards the line with a smaller tracer, slightly smaller every single time, and fitting the pearl with each time. This is a beautiful machine. Such ingenuity in its design. You can see just following the inside of that trough And that pearl fits so perfect in, I can't get it out, so I'll have to pop it out from the backside. What a great fit. All right, now using a ruler, I'm measuring out the exact taper that follows the line of the mother of pearl. Just now removing the excess material with the belt grinder, and I use this socket to measure the curve on the back of the handle and remove that excess material also. The 2x72 grinder is such a handy tool to have in the shop. I can kick it on its sides and use it in a horizontal orientation. Look at that, starting to look like the sketch. All right, time to make some sketches on the back of the handle where I will start to cut the scallops in. So I've divided this up into 7 equal slices. Measure those out carefully. Connect the points. Perfect. I'm using my vertically mounted bench vise, and then I will mount the handle onto a board. Starting now first with a small triangular file. I will first make some little notches. Once those little notches are in place, I can use a square file and really start hogging away the material. The nice thing about a file is it's so very accurate. So here's everything just rough filed in. And then on a Scotch-Brite wheel mounted on a bench grinder, I start cleaning up these scallops. Start rounding them over. Making sure that I keep the corners crisp. Just do a bit of hand sanding on this handle so I don't have any deep scratches to remove later. Sanding around the entire perimeter. Making sure the butt end is also polished. And then we coat again with some layout fluid. Using the height gauge, I'm going to mark some lines where the handle will round off. Again, with the belt grinder, I will just round off these corners, matching them up to the line. Hand sand those corners. Lots of layout fluid. Make sure that the spacers will match the handle shape. And using a fiber laser that I have, I'm just going to mark out the shape of the guard. This is a favorite way of mine because I can measure out a perfect elliptical to any size. Then trimming the excess away with the belt grinder, I will then end up with a perfect elliptical. Back to the grinder again, and this time we're going to round off the top and the bottom of the blade. Because we're going to be making a metal sheath for this knife, I like to have a nice rounded top or spine and a rounded bottom. Alright, let's do some blade grinding. First thing I do is what I start with a pre-bevel. So I grind a 45-degree angle on the very edge of the blade. This will keep the edge of the blade off the grinder as I grind the full bevels. We're going with a full flat grind on these bevels. So moving up the grits. And then using a waterfall platen to clean up the plunge line. This is such a handy tool that I discovered from Kyle Royer. Let's grind that clip in there. Nice and slowly with a 240 grit belt. And the other side. Let the hand sanding commence. Here's a time lapse again. Boy, do I wish I went that fast. This is for sure one of my favorite parts of all of knife making, is just sitting there and hand sanding and reflecting. So often you are thinking of, what you're doing, and this time you're left with, an hour of time to yourself. Get all those scratches out. Beauty. Because the pearl is not sitting flush, I'm using a pencil here to color the side of the pearl scales. And using a file, I will file a nice chamfer on the pearl scale. That way it'll almost give an appearance that it's thicker than it is, because they're a pretty thin material. My next step now is to do the etch. I quite like the pattern. I love a ladder pattern. Let's neutralize it. This is not the finish etch. This is just the depth etch. Alright, moving on now to the metal sheath. First thing I want to do is make a nice form out of some thick plate steel. I traced out the blade. The closer you get this form to the size of the blade, the neater the sheath will be. You really want to make this very, very tight. Alright, bringing up the profile there. Again, having a horizontal grinder is handy. More layout fluid. And here, I'm scribing some lines because I want to put a radius on all the corners. Going to grind that radius to the line. Okay, perfect. Now that our edges and the corners are rounded off, our form is finished. I'm going to be using some 416 stainless. That's 50 thousandths of an inch thick. And I'm going to measure it a little bit larger than the template. About a ½ inch wider around. That'll give me lots of playroom. I spent 2 days learning how to make a metal sheath with Wolfgang Lorkner. And he used a vertically mounted bench vise, and when I came home I bought one of these bench vices and mounted it to my workbench just like this because it was so handy. So here I'm layering a number of layers of material, and I'm using a little piece of wood on the top, and with a hammer I'm just going to start slightly tapping down the edges to start forming around the form. Using a small thick hammer as my hand anvil, I will be really forming that tip in good. So everything is pretty bulky now. It's not flat. Let me tap it flat a minute. And let me mark a little bit of height. And I will just grind away a bunch of excess material. Back to the belt grinder. Alright, you can see that the tip is not fully formed yet, and the sides are not finished. But slowly but surely, we're just going to be bending that tip further and further in until it matches the form perfectly. Off camera, I made the second half. And I like to surface grind these together. That way they're perfectly flat. And that's the beauty of the 416 stainless. Because it's magnetic, I can mount it to my magnetic chuck on my surface grinder. Now that the two halves are surface ground, put them together. Use some little clamps to hold them together. And then with the TIG welder, start fusion welding these halves together. This takes a bit of finesse You can see the blade slid into there. It has a nice fit. And time to clean up the whole perimeter of the sheath. I fill up the sheath with water so that it keeps it cool. And then with an extended shaft rotary bit, I clean up the inside of the sheath. And then I hand sand the sheath. Make sure all the scratches, the machine scratches, are out. So here's the sheath ready to make the collars. But firstly, we would like to cut a little shoulder on the throat of the sheath. I put a little sacrificial piece of wood in the sheath. Mount a file guide onto there. And I mill a little shoulder onto the sheath. Because it's 50 thousandths of an inch thick, I have lots of playroom. So using a file, I go around the curve and make the first throat piece. Make sure that the sheath is nicely polished, especially near the top, because now's your chance to do that. Let's slide this throat piece on, and it fits perfectly. In fact, I will just press it on to make sure it is pressed on all the way. And then from the throat of the sheath, I fusion weld it with the TIG welder. Nice and solid. Let's clean up the top there. And now we make the little collar where the blade will slide into. That fits nice. I will super glue that on there first. Make sure the blade sits nice and straight in the sheath. Pull the blade out. The super glue will keep it on. Now first give it a couple tack welds. And then I weld along the sides. Just like that. So I'm grinding it down to shape now. And off camera, I went with the TIG welder around the whole perimeter again, just to make sure that it's all sealed up. So in the front of the sheath, I will have a little cabochon. This is a little decorative piece of the same ladder pattern stainless and nickel Damascus that we've made using the fiber laser. I will mark out the elliptical with the divisions and then the center hole. Nice. Trim it down to shape. And drill that hole in there. And I'm going to be filing little scallops into this cabochon. This is a bit of a pain in the butt material. The stainless Damascus doesn't like to be filed. But managed to get it done. And again, using the Scotch-Brite wheel, going to clean up all those scallops. There is a little button stud in the center of the cabochon, and that's what I'm making right now on the lathe. So with a center drill, and then with the number 29 drill bits, I cut some 8x32 threads into the hole, and then I make a little button stud. Time to clean up that piece. Again, I'm using the Scotch-Brite wheel, such a handy wheel. And then polish it. You can see it's nice and shiny. Alright, let's find the placement of this cabochon and mark out where I need to drill the hole. There's a little screw going into the sheath. So from the inside of the sheath. And make sure you deburr the hole inside and out. So you can use a little riffler file to deburr the inside of the sheath. Here I have some felt, along with some construction tape. This is what's going to go inside the sheath. So I'm just trimming this to size. cover my whole sheath in masking tape. Mix up some epoxy. This is the C Corp epoxy. I've been a fan of this epoxy for years now. Slide in the one liner. Carefully make sure that it presses against the side. And slide in the second liner. Let's give it a test fit with the knife. Perfect. After buffing the blade and cabochon, I slip the knife into some gator piss. This brings out the darkness in the stainless layer. And with a heat gun, I set those oxides. Now we're going to clean up these parts here with some acetone. I'm applying a little bit of epoxy to the back of the cabochon. Going to screw in that little button stud. Make sure to really clean up all that glue. And now moving on to the pommel nut. Again, using the 8x32 threads. Going to make a 245 thousandths shank along with a 312 thousandths shank. It fits perfectly. Cut off that part, drill the hole in the back for the takedown tool. And we can glue in the pearl, finally. The end is in sight. That pearl is looking beautiful. Alright, time to put everything together. The spacers, the pins, the guard, the handle, finally the nut. And slide it into its finished sheath. Wow, this took me about 11 days of work. Such a nice fit on the sheath. The Damascus is looking very beautiful. I really like the combination of the shiny stainless and then the Damascus, the pearl, the carving on the back of the handle and in the scallops of the clamshell, and the carving on the cabochon. That fits so nice. And from now on, it is receiving the white glove treatment. I am so happy with how this project turned out. This little San Francisco style Bowie knife. I think this is my favorite style of knife. Certainly is a lot of fun to make this. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe. Till the next one!